Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. If our planet is burning and many scientists say we're running out of time, why aren't we doing more to deal with climate change? Let's get to the bottom line. It wasn't always such a political issue. Decades ago, Republicans and Democrats came together to work for cleaner water and cleaner air, and even created the Environmental Protection Agency. And that was created during a Republican administration. These days, despite the extreme weather faced by millions around the world, climate action has become a divisive issue, and joint action sounds like a pipe dream. Here's how everything gets kicked down the road. Poor countries blame rich countries for the damage started 150 years ago, since the Industrial Revolution. Individuals mostly feel helpless and say big corporations need to fix the damage they're making. Those big corporations turn around and say, well, the problem is so huge, the government has to deal with it. And then the governments say they don't have a consensus among their people to do much, which brings us back to square zero. In the meantime, humanity is going nowhere fast, and despite good intentions and noble efforts here and there, everything is getting hotter. So what's going to happen to us? And what are we supposed to be doing? Today we're talking with Jeff Goodall, a journalist who's been writing about energy and climate for the past 20 years. His latest book is The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. And Steve Mufson, a contributor to The Washington Post, who covers the business of climate change. Thank you to you both for joining us. Jeff, I just want to start with you. I would not have put out this book with this endorsement this way. I just want to read it to folks. It says, entertaining and thoroughly researched, blah, 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 former Vice President Al Gore. I didn't find your book entertaining at all. I found it well-written, well-researched, and deeply, deeply disturbing about what's happening, unfolding. And I'd love to give you an opportunity right now to talk about why you wrote Heat and what message you're trying to give to those readers, I would assume beyond entertainment.
Yeah, well, the title says a lot about what I'm trying to do. I know it's a deliberately provocative title, The Heat Will Kill You First. It sounds alarmist. I don't mean it to be alarmist in the sense that many people in the climate world talk about alarmism, but I think a lot of our discussion and politics about global warming and climate change is sort of set too far off in the distance, either physically in the distance, as in happening in another world, or a distance in time. And I really wanted to bring this kind of urgency to this and to really talk about what is happening now. And this is personal. Heat can kill you. You can go for a walk on a hot day, and in 2 hours later, if you're in the wrong situations and you're a vulnerable person, you can be dead. And I really wanted to bring the kind of urgency to this issue and to try to think of a way to write about this that involved people in a personal way. And I think that's perhaps something that's missing from the sort of broader politics, despite decades of endless discussion about this issue.
Well, one of the things that struck me in your first chapter, you talk about Jonathan Garish and Ellen Chung, and I'd like you to share in short form what happened to them. But I'd also like to hear about the 15,000 people who died in Paris in 2003 who didn't get the benefit of reading your book 20 years ago. So for some people, raising a clarion call right now, this may be basically saying how it is and how much worse it's going to be. But it's been bad already for a while.
Yeah, it has been bad already for a while. And, we meaning, generally educated people who understand the climate is changing and are thinking about what's the best thing to do, are really uneducated about the risks of heat. And that was, tragically, symbolized by this story of the Garish family, who I wrote about in the opening chapter. They were in their late 30s. She was in her late 30s. He was in his early 40s, a young married couple with a 1-year-old child. He was a Snapchat engineer in Silicon Valley. They decided to get out of Silicon Valley during the pandemic, start a new life in the Sierra Nevada foothills. They were outdoors people. They were educated about outdoors. They, shopped at REI and had all the gear and everything. And, they had taken a number of hikes. And one day they decided to take a hike just to a river a few miles from their front door. They hiked down into a canyon. They knew it was going to be hot. They started early. They got to the river. And then at about noon, they had to hike out of this canyon. And it was about a 2-mile hike up a steep switchback, which, by the way, had been burned by wildfires a few years earlier. So there was no shade. And exactly what happened to them, I write about in some detail in the book, but the short version of it is they didn't come home that night. Their friends got concerned. A search party went out the next day, found the entire family, the mother, the father, the 1-year-old child, and the dog, all dead on the trail from heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And, it's just emblematic to me that this can happen to any of us. It doesn't have to be farm workers or the people who are, construction workers who are the most obviously vulnerable to this. This can happen to any of us. And that's sort of the message that I really wanted to communicate most directly in this book.
This brings me to my friend Steve Mufson. Steve, when you see a book like Heat come out, and you also look at the temperatures and the hottest time we've been in the planet, my big question to you is, are we getting the equities right in that equilibrium between thinking smartly about climate in our future and the sort of realities of business and energy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, the awareness of the climate problem is, exponentially bigger than it was just a short time ago. I mean, at the Post, we did a series saying basically that the climate change had come to your door. And, it looks such an elementary thing to have said just 4 years ago, but at the time it made a huge impact. And we went to places like Qatar and wrote about people who are very much like these unfortunate couple who have trouble, in the construction sites, and hundreds of people were dying there. So yes, I think there's been a big change in public consciousness, but the question is, how does that get through to the people who are really making the important decisions? And more people are talking about that being in the hands of big private enterprises, corporations, oil companies, renewable companies, whoever. Partly because the government, right, and the people who you would expect to be regulating these issues aren't really regulating them that much. There's no support for a carbon tax. The most important and decisive regulatory issues have been basically kicked back to big business. And one of the things I'm curious about Jeff's view is, how does he see that happening? Does he expect big companies to step up and do the kinds of things that we all need done?
Well, let me ask, Jeff, when you look at it, big companies, and you look at those players that you need to actually get in a different course, what is your thought on what we best need to do? And, are big enterprises the answer?
Yeah, well, one of the big things that's changed in the time that Steve and I have been writing about this over the last decade and a half or so is the economic argument, right? The economics of clean energy have changed so dramatically. 15 years ago, it was all about subsidies for solar and this and that. And now, I live in Texas, the epicenter of the fossil fuel industry in the United States. And, 25% of our grid is solar right now, and it's booming. So the economic arguments are shifted dramatically, right? And one of the things that's most kind of concerning for me, and the difficult part of the politics as I see it, is that climate and energy to a degree have become part of the sort of cultural war in America. And it's all about, kind of debasing the science. It's, you can't believe the scientists. It's a conspiracy. It is, it's become, evident, it's sort of like the anti-vax movement in America, this sort of just distrust of what's really happening. And that makes it the conversation a lot more difficult, and for corporate leadership, we've seen the big oil and gas companies, saying the right things, but when you look at what they're actually doing, they're not really moving fast enough at all. They're interested in preserving their stockholder value. They're interested in slowing down this transition generally. Some are better than others. But I think we're at a really tough moment politically. I think, as tough as anything I've seen in the time I've been covering this.
Steve, when you kind of look at the scale and size and profits they have, aren't we somehow dependent on some of those large fossil fuel enterprises to kind of create the next, on the energy front? Isn't that part of it?
It's definitely part of it because, the big oil companies have some of the biggest investment capital spending programs in corporate America. So, Vicky's doing some interesting work there. They're going to build out a lot of carbon capture facilities and try to pump that stuff back into the ground. But it's not clear to me how that affects Oxy's business as a fossil fuel company. I think a lot of people see that as a way to distract people from the fossil fuel business, which is still going to be alive and well.
And Steve, what about, Dan Yergin was on my show not too long ago, and Dan said even if gasoline in its traditional form is put out of business, we electrify everything, we're still so dependent across our society, from vaccines to plastics to EVs, all of the things that the petrochemical industry produces now we don't talk about it, but it's embedded everywhere.
Clothing.
And is there a dimension?
There's hardly a piece of clothing you can buy that doesn't have some element of nylon or of the things that petrochemical companies.
So
make.
is primitivism the only option here?
No, I don't think so. I think there's a lot that can be done. I think the question is, when can it be done, and on what scale? So, I think if you had asked me 15 years ago, whether I could imagine this kind of change and pace of change happening, no, definitely not. But it's still a long ways from where we need to be to get a grip on the climate change.
Jeff, what I appreciated very much in your book, and it worked with me, and I hope it works with other readers, is you kind of have a disdain, if you will, for words like climate change and all the gradualism that we have built in to a discussion of this. In my view, you sort of treat heat as a storm, as a tornado, as a fire, something that can come and happen to an area and create enormous things. It creates much more action in the way you deal with heat, which most of us are taught to sort of think as a gradual, straight line event. And I'd love you to just reflect for a moment in short form. Something that mattered a lot to me was to watch the Pacific Northwest a few years ago basically get cooked alive, and billions of organisms perished and died. And you just saw this go on. And I don't know if many people even remember it. But on top of this, you talk about something called the Goldilocks Zone. Can you share with our audience those two reflections?
Yeah, so let's start with the Goldilocks Zone. The Goldilocks Zone is a phrase that scientists use who are looking for life on other planets. They're looking for the presence of liquid water. That's a good indicator of a planet that might have life on it. So if it's too cold, it's ice. If it's too hot, the water is vaporized and there's nothing there. So they talk about planets with liquid water as the Goldilocks Zone. And it applies also to life on Earth here, because everything that us and everything around us, all the plants, all the animals, everything that's alive, evolved in this relatively stable climate. And we've developed mechanisms for dealing with a range of temperatures that, we're used to in our evolutionary history. We can deal with, 100, 110 degrees. We can deal with, 60 degree, 50 degree cold, but we can't deal with 50 below zero, and we can't deal with 130. Our bodily mechanisms are not set for that, right? And it's true not just of humans, but of everything. And one of the things that's really, important to grasp that what's happening now is that we've left the old climate behind. The amount of CO2 and everything that we have in the atmosphere is changing the atmospheric dynamics in a very profound way. We're not going back. This is not a new normal. It's like what scientist Michael Mann calls a new abnormal. And so we're going to have more and more of these extreme events. And the Pacific Northwest in 2021 was a great example of that. I mean, who imagined that we could get 121 degree temperatures in British Columbia and Washington State? And we had a town essentially spontaneously combust in British Columbia. It's like snow in the Sahara. So we're playing now in a new climate that is, we don't really understand what the rules are, how hot it can get, and we're pushing out of this zone that we have habituated and lived in for so long into new levels and new risks. And, wandering around Phoenix on a 100-degree day is very different than wandering around Phoenix on a 125-degree day. And our bodies cannot last for very long in that kind of temperature. We don't have the heat relief mechanisms to survive in those temperatures.
Well, Stephen, one of the heat relief mechanisms that we created, and there's a colorful chapter in this book that starts with looking at William Faulkner, very famous writer in American history, his funeral and how hot it was in Oxford, Mississippi. And Faulkner hated air conditioning, but air conditioning is one of the ways that we have been able to manage those temperatures and heat, so to speak. But I'm really interested in the geopolitical dimensions of that, or even the internal dimensions, the have versus have-nots in providing what Jeff calls, cheap, cold air. And where are we, do you think, in that geopolitical divide around the world? Because a lot of people in Africa will say, hey, we've been here already for a lot longer than you folks.
Yes, that's true. And I think that, we wrote about Qatar as an example of where...
so one of the richest places in the world.
One of the richest places. So air conditioning is exploding in Qatar. And it's interesting also because it's not just a question of high temperatures, it's also a question of the lower temperatures in the range. So what makes Doha particularly a hot place isn't just the daytime temperature of 115 or whatever, it's the nighttime temperatures that don't get below 90. And that's one of the things we're seeing now here in the US. Phoenix isn't just difficult because of the high end of that spectrum. It's the low end as well, which is also overnight lows in the 90s.
Jeff, I'd love you to talk about the prospect of what you call, I think it was cheap cold air, and how it's not basically an egalitarianly shared good, and what you think needs to happen. Because, again, I just want our readers to know this isn't, I met Roger Revelle, who was warning about, carbon in the air, 40, 50 years ago. I met him 40 years ago. I wish this book had been written 40 years ago, but we're now 40 years into this. So we're living in real time watching, what your concerns are play out. And we may, as you write, see literally a staggering number of people. Let me just read this one item here from your book, which is staggering. That right now, there are 30 million people today living in extreme heat. And you predict by 2070, some of you folks are going to be around in 2070, 2 billion people are likely to live in extreme heat and also die in extreme heat. So what do you think are some of the mediation mechanisms that we have to take much more seriously than we are?
Well, I mean, the first one is obviously reducing fossil fuels emissions as quickly as possible, because that's what's causing, our planet to warm up. So any conversation about what to do has to start with that and accelerating that dramatically. But, air conditioning is a great subject because, a lot of people just think it's like, okay, we have a fix for heat. We just need to get everybody air conditioning, and we need to democratize air conditioning. And that sounds good, but it's not going to happen. I mean, we can certainly get more air conditioning to more people. It's important to do that, subsidizing electric bills, things like that, even buying free air conditioners for people. But there are billions of people on this planet who do not have air conditioning and are not going to have air conditioning anytime soon. Moreover, we are not going to air condition the oceans. We are not going to air condition the wheat fields and cornfields where our food is grown. We are not going to air condition all of the other creatures on this planet that suffer from extreme heat in exactly the same way that we do. So, yes, we can create a bubble for ourselves and live in that bubble, but that is not the world that we want to live in, I don't think, and it certainly doesn't resemble the world that we're in now. And the final thing about that is that dependence upon air conditioning not only pushes the electric grid for consume more power, it also puts it at risk during these high heat events. So one of the infrastructure experts I talked about in Phoenix talked about what he called an inevitability of a heat Katrina, referring to Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans a decade or so, excuse me, a decade or so ago. If we have a major blackout in one of these, a city like Austin or Phoenix or Las Vegas or Houston or whatever, during one of these blackouts, there are going to be a lot of deaths. Our buildings are built now with sealed windows, with this idea that we need to have, no natural ventilation. It's all dependent upon these machines that blow the air in and out. If that fails, we're in big trouble. And so by creating this sort of air-conditioned fantasy, we are, perpetuating this. What we need to do is think about buildings in a different way that use natural ventilation systems. We used to know how to do that. We've forgotten that because of air conditioning. We need more public spaces for people to have access to cooling. We need more green spaces in cities, more trees. There's a lot of things that we can do beyond simply air conditioning to deal with this.
Jeff, let me ask you what you're going to tell an audience if you find yourself at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I frequently go. I hope I'm in the audience when you tell them. But I'm just interested in this tension over greenwashing and what you, you call it out. And so what are you going to tell these rich and powerful players in the global economy what they need to do to wake up and help save us, if you will?
Well, first of all, I highly doubt I'm going to be at Davos addressing this crowd. But, if I were, it would be some version of, let's get serious about this. You have a lot at risk, too. You think you don't, but you do. And, your economics, whatever businesses you're in, we're all at risk. And how do we, communicate? This is where I end my book, is that wherever this journey is taking us on this superheated planet that we're building for ourselves, there is no get out of jail free card. We are all engaged in this. We're all on this journey together. And whether you're flying around in a private jet, which hopefully we're not doing because of the carbon emissions and all of the things that come with that, but we are all in this together, and we are all going to survive and thrive together, and we really can build a better world. I really am optimistic at this moment that we can use this kind of inflection, if you will, this kind of moment when people are paying attention and saying, oh my God, what is happening? Is the sky broken? To really build political consensus, to build coalitions, to say we can change things, we can change where our energy comes from, we can change how we build buildings, we can change how we build food. This is coming, we have to accept it, and we can do better, and this is a moment to seize.
Well, this is an incredible, vividly told journey through what heat is doing to us. Very grateful for it. Jeff Goodall, author of The Heat Will Kill You First, and Steve Mufson, climate change reporter. Thank you so much for joining with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So what's the bottom line? Well, folks, there's just no silver lining. The world is having its hottest year right now in recorded history, and is likely to surge higher. We're watching as ecosystems are decimated, sea creatures literally cooked alive. The human body just doesn't fare well in heat, as Jeff Goodall outlined. And so far, we've been trying to sculpt our homes, our markets, our cars, and workplaces to manage temperature. Some can do that, but most folks in the world don't have the luxury. Yes, we need smarter climate and energy policies that reduce emissions. But guess what? The day has already arrived when temperatures have reached dangerous levels because we failed to heed the warnings of decades ago. And that's, sadly, the bottom line.